Chapter 5. Pre-Modern Period. Edo. 35. The Battle of Sekigahara. As he grew old, Hideyoshi worried about who would succeed him as the central figure of the country. Because he had no children of his own, he adopted his nephew Hidetsugu. Hidetsugu already had children, so the ladder of succession seemed clear. Then a major problem came up. Hideyoshi's consort, Yorogimi, gave birth to a son. To make a long story short, Hideyoshi ordered Hidetsugu to commit suicide. He then slaughtered all of Hidetsugu's retainers, women, and children. He even had Hidetsugu's elegant Jurakudai destroyed. This cleared the path for Hideyoshi's 2-year-old son, Hideyori, to become the heir to power. Of course, it would be years before Hideyori would be capable of taking control. Hideyoshi tried to prepare for this by organizing 5 powerful allies as a senior advisory council called Gotairo. These men expressed their loyalty to Hideyoshi. They promised to oversee the government until Hideyori was old enough to take charge. 3 years later, Hideyoshi died. His allies immediately began to argue among themselves. A new struggle for domination began. Surprisingly, the issue of supremacy was decided in one battle on October 21, 1600. 2 armies totaling 110,000 soldiers assembled at Sekigahara. Forces mostly from western Japan gathered under the leadership of Ishida Mitsunari. Forces from eastern Japan gathered under the command of Tokugawa Ieyasu. Some daimyo and their troops refused to fight. Others switched sides at the last minute. A significant number of daimyo went over to the eastern army. The battle turned into a rout. By the end of the day, Ieyasu and his allies had won. 36. Establishment of the shogunate at Edo. Ieyasu chose Edo as his castle town after defeating the Hojo at Odawara in 1590. After his victory at Sekigahara, he made Edo the headquarters of his regime. His choice shifted the center of Japanese society from the Kansai region to the Kanto region. Ieyasu received the title of shogun from the emperor in Kyoto in 1603. Ieyasu continued the basic administrative and political policies of Hideyoshi. He developed them into the Bakuhan system. In this system, the government operated through 2 mechanisms, the shogunate, Bakufu, and the daimyo domain, Han. Ieyasu established some of his loyal retainers as daimyo. These Fudai daimyo became hereditary vassals. There were eventually 145 of these daimyo. The second class of daimyo was the shimpan, or collateral daimyo. They were related to the Tokugawa family. Eventually, they numbered around 23. The third class was the tozama daimyo, or outside lords. Some of these joined the Tokugawa before the Battle of Sekigahara. Others fought against the Tokugawa but were spared. There were about 98 of these daimyo at the end of the 18th century. In addition to these 3 groups, the Tokugawa house itself directly controlled granary lands, tenryo. Other major landholders were the shogun's bannermen, hatamoto. Ieyasu's grandson, Iemitsu, later strengthened Tokugawa control. He confiscated daimyo lands and gave them to other lords who were more reliable. He sometimes forced daimyo to trade domains. This, of course, weakened them. Slowly, he built his power base surrounding Edo with Fudai and Shimpan relatives. The tozama were placed in the distant regions of Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. 37. Destruction of Osaka Castle. When Ieyasu shuffled daimyo from one domain to another, large numbers of samurai were left without masters to serve. These ronin, masterless samurai, had pride as warriors, but had no way to earn a living. Many of them drifted to Osaka in hopes of entering the service of Hideyoshi's heir, Hideyori. Ieyasu had sworn to serve as regent for Hideyori. But once Ieyasu gained control of the country, he tried to get Hideyori to accept reality. Ieyasu was in charge of the shogunate, and he would not step aside for Hideyori. Hideyori remained in the massive Osaka castle as its lord, but he had no power beyond that domain. When large groups of ronin gathered at Osaka, there was a showdown. Ieyasu decided that he had the political and military capability to eliminate Hideyori. In 1614, Ieyasu used the pretext of an imagined slight to launch an attack on Osaka Castle. It was perhaps the greatest castle in the country and was defended by some 90,000 troops. Ieyasu had a force of twice that size, but Hideyori's forces were successful in defending the castle. As part of the negotiations between the two forces, a portion of the castle's moats was filled in. The Tokugawa labor squads filled in more of the moats than negotiations called for. Ieyasu attacked again in 1615, and Hideyori committed suicide. The castle was torched, and the last challenge to Tokugawa control was eliminated. Ieyasu destroyed Hideyori, the Toyotomi legacy as a whole, and the troublesome ronin. 38. The feudal class system. The shogunate adopted a Confucian class structure for all official purposes. Society was divided into 4 classes: warrior, shi, farmer, no, artisan, ko, and merchant, shou. Expectations were different for each class. The warriors were required to live in towns, inside their lord's castle, or in special neighborhoods for samurai only. This separated them from the land and made them dependent on their lord. They trained in the martial arts and were always prepared to carry out military duties. The majority, however, were assigned to administrative duties. They received an annual stipend or salary from the daimyo, so they had to show loyalty to their lord. Literacy became important to gain high positions and promotions. Roughly 80% of society's members were farmers living in villages. They were not allowed to possess weapons, change residence, or travel without permission. They were only allowed to wear clothing made of cotton. They were not allowed to drink sake or tea. They were required to eat less rice and more wheat and millet. They were expected to work hard and live economically. They grew crops and produced handicrafts, notably textiles. The artisans and merchants were grouped together as chonin, townspeople. They lived in restricted neighborhoods of the castle towns. They were expected to provide services to the samurai class. There were restrictions on how they could live, dress, and conduct their businesses. They were not allowed to marry into samurai families. There were several exceptions to this 4-class structure. These were the court aristocrats, kuge, priests and nuns, so and ni, and outcasts. 39. Sankin Kotai. The shogun introduced a unique system for controlling the daimyo in the 1630s. It was the requirement of alternate attendance, or sankin kotai. Every daimyo had a residence within his domain. The sankin kotai system required that each daimyo also build another residence near Edo Castle. Every other year, the daimyo were required to travel to the capital. The Tozama daimyo moved in and out of Edo during the 4th month of the year. The Fudai daimyo moved in and out in the 2nd and 8th months. While in Edo, they had to pay formal visits to the shogun. They presented high-bred horses, high-quality swords, and other expensive gifts as symbols of their gratitude. In the beginning, this was required of the Tozama daimyo only, but by 1642, it was required of all daimyo. Eventually, they were divided into different groups so that half of the Tozama and half of the Fudai were in Edo in a particular year. The system had several effects. First, it required the daimyo to spend a lot of their income. It cost a lot to travel to Edo and maintain 2 separate residences. The daimyo could not accumulate individual financial strength. Second, it enabled the shogunate to keep close watch over the activities of the daimyo. The daimyo left their principal wives and heirs in the comfortable Edo residence along with staff as permanent hostages. Weapons were not allowed to come into Edo. Women were not allowed to leave Edo. These regulations prevented daimyo from attempting to overthrow Tokugawa rule. 40. Shimabara Rebellion. Initially, most Japanese leaders welcomed arriving Europeans. For daimyo during the period of warring states, the Europeans provided access to important information. The Europeans had useful knowledge about geography, map-making, shipbuilding, and navigation. They had muskets and other military technology. They brought trade in goods that were unavailable in Japan. Some daimyo became interested in Christianity, partly because of their interest in trade with these Europeans. Japan's unifiers gradually became suspicious of those who came as Christian missionaries. Christianity preached the need for exclusive loyalty to God. That meant obedience to a foreign god instead of a Japanese daimyo. As early as 1587, Hideyoshi issued a decree saying that all Jesuits had to leave the country immediately. He did not actively enforce the decree, but it was a sign that attitudes were changing. In 1614, Ieyasu again ordered all missionaries to leave the country. Anti-Christian attitudes reached a peak in the 1630s. Several Kyushu daimyo and the people of their domains became Christians. Discontented ronin joined a peasant uprising in Kyushu under Amakusa Shiro. The Shimabara Rebellion was at least partly caused by poverty caused by heavy taxation. The shogunate was not going to allow a challenge to its authority for any reason. A huge army was sent to suppress the rebellion. The rebels were put under siege at Hara Castle on the Shimabara Peninsula. The castle fell, and the shogunate forces slaughtered some 35,000 men, women, and children in the castle. This turned out to be the last major fighting involving the Tokugawa armies until 2 centuries later. 41. From licensed foreign trade to national seclusion. In the decade after Sekigahara, Tokugawa Ieyasu developed a system of maritime trade passes, shuinjō. The shuinjō authorized a merchant vessel to make a single voyage from Japan to one specific destination. Vermilion seal ship trade, Shuinsen Boeki, was carried out by foreign and Japanese merchants and by various daimyo. Official records show a total of 356 licenses were issued. The licensed ships, called shuinsen, were permitted to sail to ports in East and Southeast Asia. The Bakufu saw any attack on a vessel with such a trade pass as a challenge to its authority. This guaranteed the safety of the ship, even in seas far distant from Japan. The pass system was created for 2 purposes. First, it distinguished real merchants from pirates. The Shuin Pass offered proof to foreign ports that the ship was a legitimate trading ship from Japan. Second, it allowed the Bakufu to control profitable sea routes. The Bakufu used this to suppress powerful Western daimyo who might benefit from trade. This maritime pass system continued until 1635. Between 1633 and 1639, the Bakufu issued a series of so-called seclusion edicts. One banned the teaching and the practice of Christianity. A second forbade Japanese to travel abroad or to return from overseas. A third banned Portuguese ships from entering any Japanese port. A fourth strictly restricted foreign trade. Another, in 1641, restricted Dutch traders to Dejima, an artificial island constructed in Nagasaki harbor. As a result, Japan entered a kind of national seclusion, sakoku, which lasted more than 2 centuries. 42. The Dutch settlement at Dejima. Actually, the term sakoku, national seclusion, did not appear until around 1800. Japan was never completely secluded. The Dutch and Chinese were authorized to carry on trade from Nagasaki. Daimyo and merchants in Satsuma, Tsushima, and Matsumae were allowed to trade with the Ryukyu Islands, Korea, and territories to the north of Japan. The first Dutch ship arrived in Japan in 1600, 6 months before the battle at Sekigahara. The English pilot, William Adams, went to meet Tokugawa Ieyasu, the future shogun. Adams later became an advisor to the shogun. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, first arrived in Japan in 1609 at the port of Hirado. They arrived at a fortunate time. The new shogunate was willing to let them trade freely, but that would change over time. In 1641, the Dutch trading station was moved to a permanent site on Dejima, an island in Nagasaki Bay. The Dutch imported silk, herbs, spices, sugar, and medicines, and exported copper, swords, pottery, and lacquerware. The shogunate was suspicious of the Spanish and Portuguese, who were closely connected with Catholic missionaries. It was suspicious of the VOC too, but the Dutch seemed to have no religious motives. Therefore, it allowed the Dutch to carry on trade, but with tight controls. Gradually, the shogunate made the Dutch into vassals. The Dutch were required to make the annual processions to Edo with gifts. They were also required to serve the shogun when necessary. 43. New castle towns. Under the Tokugawa regime, the daimyo constructed castles different from the Sengoku castles. Wars occurred less frequently, so the castles were no longer strategically located military fortresses. Instead, the new castles were built in flat plains and were called hirajiro. They were symbols of power. The tall donjon at the center of the castle compound was built to show the daimyo's authority. People far away could see it rising in the middle of his territory. Two good examples of this type are Nagoya Castle and Nijo Castle. After the beginning of the Tokugawa period, the castles were not primarily military headquarters. They became centers of political administration and commerce. They were headquarters for controlling a domain's resources. The towns that grew around the castle walls had separate residential areas for samurai. High-ranking samurai had large residences. Lower-ranking samurai lived in smaller residences. Commoners, including artisans, peddlers, day laborers, and merchants, lived in separate districts. These chonin, or townsmen, were supposed to serve the needs of the administration in the castle. The carpenters, ironworkers, plasterers, and stoneworkers built the castle and other buildings. The merchants purchased the goods that the daimyo and the samurai wanted. When castle towns grew larger, the townsmen also served the needs of other townsmen. Through the Tokugawa period, there were between 200 and 250 of these castle towns around the country. 44. Transportation networks. The Kaido. The shogunate created and maintained an extensive road system across the country. The roads were created to supply city residents with material goods and facilitate military control. The roads also allowed huge processions of daimyo to reach Edo for alternate residence. Two main roads linked Edo with Kyoto and Osaka. The Tokaido Road went along the Pacific coast. The Nakasendo Road went through the Central Mountains. From these major roads, connecting roads reached out into the countryside in all directions. Along each road were post towns where people could spend the night. The post towns became economic centers of the region. The daimyo processions, with hundreds of servants, warriors, and officials, needed places to stay at the end of each day's journey. A network of first-class inns was created for the daimyo of larger domains. Daimyo of smaller domains stayed in less elaborate inns. Itinerant merchants, pilgrims, and other commoners stayed in even less extravagant lodgings. The Gokaido, the 5 highways including the Tokaido and Nakasendo, radiated from Nihonbashi in Edo. The roads were tightly regulated. At a number of barrier stations, sekisho, officials checked identification. These stations allowed the shogunate to monitor communications and troop movements. The shogunate also depended on coastal shipping by kaisen, circuit ships. Cargo boat trade flourished. Daimyo from all over the country needed to send their tax rice to market. They converted the rice to cash and sent it to Edo to support their alternate residences. Rice traders in Sakai and Osaka became rich loaning money to daimyo. 45. Genroku culture. A century of Tokugawa peace created an increase in agricultural productivity. This led to a rise in commerce, the growth of cities, and affluence. In the hierarchy of Shino Kosho, the townsmen were at the bottom. The very bottom was the merchant class, but many of them became quite prosperous. The Genroku era lasted from 1688 until 1703. But the Genroku cultural period is roughly from 1675 to 1725. It was a period of prosperity, extravagance, and indulgence. Theater, poetry, prose, and woodblock prints flourished in this remarkable period. The merchants of this bourgeois culture, chonin bunka, created a demand for new goods and services. They wanted clothing, art, and entertainment that matched their lifestyle. Some began to seek instruction in elegant pastimes, yuge. They practiced tea ceremony, flower arrangement, musical instruments, dance, and dramatic recitation, joruri. A sophisticated form of kabuki appeared, with all roles played by men. The plays came from military tales, classic no drama, and puppet plays. Several playwrights and actors of superb ability transformed kabuki into a stage art which captivated both the elite and commoners alike. Especially popular was Chikamatsu Monzaemon. His play, The Treasury of Loyal Retainers, Chushingura, is still popular today. The townspeople also read the tales of the floating world, ukiyo-zoshi, by writers such as Ihara Saikaku. Saikaku combined an elegant style with themes that appealed to the townsmen, such as the life of an amorous man. They admired and bought the ukiyo-e of Hishikawa Moronobu. He is the artist primarily responsible for the establishment of ukiyo-e as an independent art form. 46. National learning. National learning, kokugaku, is the study of Japanese classical literature and ancient writings. It began in the 17th century with scholars like Kamo no Mabuchi, Motoori Norinaga, and Hirata Atsutane. Mabuchi was a great admirer of the spirit of the Manyoshu. He believed that these ancient poems expressed the true Japanese spirit. This was the spirit that existed before the introduction of Buddhist and Confucian culture from China. Norinaga focused on the tale of Genji and waka literature. He emphasized mono no aware, an appreciation of ephemeral beauty in nature and human life. This sensibility, he said, was the principle behind all Japanese literature. National learning began as a literary movement, but it also had social and political implications. Hirata Atsutane, for example, stressed the special nature of Japan because of its godly origins. Such scholars said it was important to study the distinctive writings in order to learn how to govern effectively. Their studies laid the basis for a conservative reaction to foreign threats. The writings of the national studies scholars were later used as evidence for the divine descent of the emperor. This put the imperial house in the center of Japanese culture. During the Bakumatsu period, conservatives would express these ideas in the slogan Sonno Joi, revere the emperor, expel the barbarian. 47. Rangaku, Dutch studies. By the 1720s, the shogunate stopped trying to keep out European influence. Tokugawa Yoshimune lifted the ban on importing foreign books as long as they did not mention Christianity. People other than official interpreters were also allowed to engage in Rangaku, short for Orandagaku, or Dutch studies. The language was Dutch, but the content included geography, astronomy, science, mathematics, pharmacology, and medicine. In the beginning, Dutch studies was a means of gathering essential information about potential rivals. It was seen as a strategy for strengthening Japan's position against Europeans. Western knowledge had a significant impact on Japan. It changed the way the Japanese saw Japan, China, and the West. Rangaku scholar Sugita Genpaku, for example, witnessed the dissection of a criminal and was greatly surprised. He found that the diagrams in a book from the West were much more accurate than traditional Chinese books. His translation of the book into Japanese stimulated others to learn Dutch in order to gain similar knowledge. Eventually, the shogunate saw the need for more of such knowledge. In 1811, it opened an early form of Bansho Shirabesho, the Institute for the Investigation of Barbarian Books. This institute actively translated, studied, and taught Western languages. It focused on scientific and technical studies. Dutch studies became urgent from the 1850s. Fukuzawa Yukichi went to Nagasaki in 1854 and used Dutch to study gunnery. He later settled in Edo in 1858 to open his own school for learning Dutch. Later, he and others switched to English because it was more widely used in the West. 48. Persistent problems. In the early years of the Tokugawa period, it was the samurai and the retainers of transferred daimyo who raised their voices in protest. They resented the way the Tokugawa shogun treated them. In that period, the farmers who worked on the land were afraid to protest because they would be violently suppressed. As the shogunate stabilized control, however, spontaneous, single-issue organizations called ikki became more common. These groups protested unfair taxation, price gouging, official arrogance, and repressive labor assessments. From the point of view of the authorities, regular payment of taxes was essential to maintaining the government. From the point of view of the farmers, payment of such taxes in times of disaster meant that their families were left with nothing to eat. When officials turned a deaf ear to their complaints, the only option the farmers and their supporters had was to form ikki organizations to make their appeals heard. Starving people joined in collective action in order to demand popular justice. 49. Oshio Heihachiro's Rebellion. In 1833, crop failures due to cold weather and floods led to 4 years of starvation in the countryside. During this tempo famine, the price of rice in the cities rose rapidly. Uprisings of farmers and townsmen occurred throughout the country. They reached a peak in 1836. It seemed that the shogunate administrators were indifferent to the suffering of the people. One samurai bureaucrat left the Osaka city government in disgust at what he saw. Oshio Heihachiro left his position to study the teachings of Wang Yangming, who taught the unity of knowledge and action. He took these teachings, called Yomeigaku, to mean that he was personally responsible for making positive changes to society. He was determined to follow these teachings to achieve justice. First, he sold his library and gave the money to feed the poor. He then gathered a few firearms and prepared a manifesto for action. He called on peasants and tenant farmers to come together to combat the authorities. They targeted bureaucrats who suppressed the poor. They planned to take the wealth of the rich merchants and divide it among the poor. They intended to divide land of the big landowners among the landless peasants. In February 1837, Oshio set fire to his house in Osaka. This was his signal for his followers to rise up in revolt against misgovernment. His followers set more fires and broke into merchant homes and storehouses. In the end, however, Bakufu troops suppressed their rebellion. 50. Appearance of foreign ships. The Dutch traders protected their trade monopoly at Nagasaki. Meanwhile, British and Russian ships began appearing along Japan's coast. This caused local daimyo and the shogunate to worry. In 1808, they panicked when the major British warship HMS Phaeton appeared in Nagasaki harbor. The crew and cannon were prepared for military action, and the captain asked for water and other supplies. The captain's request was refused. The crew took what they could and escaped. The shogunate worried about what would happen next. It was clear that such foreign ships were far superior in firepower, so Japan could not successfully resist them. By the 1820s, new foreign ships began to appear. They were Western whalers searching for whales in the Pacific Ocean. They especially looked for whales in the seas east of Japan. Occasionally, one of these ships appeared off the Japanese coast looking for supplies or a safe harbor. Occasionally, whaling crews came to shore as shipwrecks. A pair of incidents in 1824, one near Mito and another south of Kyushu, made the shogunate deeply aware of the vulnerability of Japan's coasts. Seeing these ships as a threat to the Tokugawa government, in 1825 the shogunate issued a command. It told the daimyo to drive them away, uchiharai. The daimyo were ordered to fire on the ships without hesitation, ninen naku. For over a decade, there were no major incidents. Few foreign ships approached shore. When a ship did approach, the local daimyo put off taking action, and eventually the ship simply sailed away. 51. Commodore Perry and the Black Ships. In the West, in the middle of the 19th century, lamp oil came from whales. American whaling ships were at sea for months and even years. As they hunted for whales, they needed fresh supplies of water and food. Sometimes they needed to land in order to make repairs. At other times, they actually became stranded and were unable to sail away. To protect whalers and other types of ships, U.S. President Fillmore dispatched Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan. Perry's fleet of 4 ships arrived at Uraga on Edo Bay in July 1853. These black ships were huge. They were 6 or more times the size of any Japanese ship. They carried 61 cannons. Commodore Perry delivered a set of demands from the U.S. government. He said he would return for a response from the Japanese government. Perry returned on February 12, 1854, with a fleet of 9 ships, including 3 steamships. Ultimately, the shogunate decided that it had to agree to the American demands. It signed the Treaty of Peace and Amity between the United States and the Empire of Japan, commonly called the Kanagawa Treaty. The treaty included the opening of 2 ports, Shimoda and Hakodate, and Japan promised to supply American ships there. Japan also agreed to provide good treatment to shipwrecked American sailors. The treaty also allowed an American consulate to be established in Shimoda. This treaty ended the policy of national isolation. The shogunate concluded similar treaties with the British that same year, Russia in 1855, and the Dutch in 1856. 52. Resistance to opening ports. The first American consul general arrived in Shimoda in 1856. Townsend Harris began negotiating for an agreement on trade between the 2 countries. Harris argued that negotiating a treaty with the United States was a way to restrain European imperialism, and that it would also be in Japan's self-interest. For Japan, a negotiated treaty was better than a forced treaty. But the Bakufu stance faced significant opposition from the daimyo and from the anti-foreign imperial court. In actual fact, the increasing power of the emperor required his agreement to any treaty. But in 1858, Ii Naosuke, the new shogunate strongman, signed the treaty without imperial approval. As a result, criticism of the shogunate increased. Ii then carried out the Ansei Purge, 1858 to 1859, punishing about 100 anti-shogunate activists for undermining the power of the government. These events further worsened relations between the forces supporting the imperial court and those supporting the shogunate. Among those executed in this purge was an activist named Yoshida Shoin. Although he was a scholar of Confucianism, he insisted that Japan should acquire Western learning and technology. Yoshida taught that practical action and setting an example for others was immensely important. His intense idealism attracted a significant group of future leaders at the national level. When he was executed, he became a martyr and a model for those who would take action for their political and social views. In March 1860, samurai of a rival domain took revenge on Ii for what they saw as his high-handedness. They assassinated him outside the Sakurada Gate of Edo Castle. 53. Bakumatsu tensions. Opposition to the shogunate spread throughout the country. Opponents were partly inspired by scholars of Mito domain. These scholars stressed that the emperor system was the central element in Japanese history. This implied that the Tokugawa shogunate was not fully legitimate. So-called Mito learning, Mitogaku, was not openly anti-Bakufu, but it presented ideas that others adopted. Under the slogan Son no Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarian, anti-Tokugawa groups carried out assassinations in Edo and Kyoto. Opponents of the shogunate gained control of Choshu with secret support from Satsuma domain. The shogunate attempted to punish Choshu with military power but failed. The shogunate was losing control of the country. Shogun Tokugawa Yoshinobu announced in November 1867 that he was going to return political power to the emperor. On January 3, 1868, a group from Satsuma, Tosa, and other domains seized the imperial palace in Kyoto. They were able to get an imperial announcement that the Tokugawa government, the shogunate, was abolished. From then on, the announcement said, government power and all Tokugawa lands, a quarter of the lands of the country, were returned to the imperial throne. Yoshinobu put up a short military resistance but gave in within a month.